right, we are back with another edition of a response to David Pallmann's video on his critique of the free thinking argument. I'm Josh Klein hosting this response, and Dr. Tim Stratton is joining me because the critique is about you, after all, Dr. Tim. We left off last time about 3 hours of conversation about it. Some got into the weeds of some things. I know that possibly you wanted to add a little bit on the genetic fallacy discussion that we had. So hand it over to you, and then we'll get started with the video after that.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. One of Pallmann's critiques was that I was committing the genetic fallacy here when I'm so focused on how a person thinks. If somebody is determining the manner in which somebody thinks and how one deliberates, and the agent himself is not in control of that, then I argue that one doesn't have the control condition necessary for justified true beliefs. So I like to say, if one is not, or no, if something or someone else is in complete control of one's mental condition, then one does not have the control condition necessary for this, for justified true beliefs here. And so, as I noted in my YouTube video called An Epistemological Case Against Calvinism, I showed how sometimes when one considers the source, then it's not committing the genetic fallacy. After all, we hear it all the time. When somebody says something, you hear them say, well, consider the source, right? Okay, so that's what I'm doing here. And when you do this, it's not committing the genetic fallacy. After all, let's consider a courtroom drama. Suppose that the prosecuting attorney called Loki, the god of mischief, who is known to always look for opportunities to deceive others and has already perjured himself in countless other cases. This prosecuting attorney calls Loki to the stand as the prosecution's key witness against the defendant. In the defense, so let's say that then that the defense attorney points out that the jury can't be influenced by Loki's testimony, because the only reason they would think the defendant is guilty is because of the god of mischief's testimony, Loki. Now, imagine the absurdity if the prosecuting attorney responded, "You're just committing the genetic fallacy." Well, that would be absurd. And David Pallmann's objection is just as absurd. So if one considers the source and it's an untrustworthy source, and you have reason to think that it is an untrustworthy source that's causing the entirety of your mental activity or causing you to think a certain metaphysical belief is true, then it's not the genetic fallacy. You have good reason to doubt what comes from an untrustworthy source. So yeah, just add that to everything we said about the genetic fallacy in the last video.
Okay, I think that's good, and that's a great video. So we'll put it in the description and invite you to go watch the reasoning that comes from that. So what we left off, I believe. Let me share the screen here. There we go. Oops. See, I thought I was going to do better this time. There we go. We left off, I believe, here at about this the 28-minute mark.
Yeah.
So let's get it started.
Does any of this, and based upon repeated interactions with him over the issue, he seems incapable of doing so. Perhaps Stratton could attempt to argue that we cannot know which of our beliefs are rational, since under determinism, we do not control which inference is made. However, because evidence is something of which we are directly aware, we can trace the justification, or lack thereof, for our inferential beliefs right down to their foundation.
All right, stop that.
If we are determined.
So Pallmann says that we can trace the justification or lack thereof for our inferential beliefs right down to their foundation. Well, I say, there it is again. Pallmann is using active libertarian language to say that libertarian freedom is not necessary. It's ultimately self-defeating. It's a self-defeating move, but Pallmann is obviously not directly aware of his fallacious reasoning. As I noted in our last video, and in multiple other places as well, mere awareness of evidence is vital, but it's not enough. One needs at least some active control over their deliberative rational cognition. One needs to be the pilot of the ship of reason, not a passive passenger or a passive passenger who's directly aware of a false reality. You know, at the last Evangelical Philosophical Society meeting, Kenton Sparks gave a talk and described this key difference. He talked about intuitive cognition, which would be the passive knowledge process that runs without you thinking about it, right? And then compared and contrasted that with rational cognition, which would be the active knowledge process of which we know things or think that we know things. That is something that we are actively in control of. So the former is passive and we have no control over it, but the latter is active. We have sourcehood control over the manner in which or the how we engage in the process of reason. And, you know, J.P. Moreland and I discussed this in our paper. Let me pull this up here. It's called An Explanation and Defense of the Free Thinking Argument. Let me read this quote. We say, not only does this passive cognus seem to oppose the teachings of Scripture, it also stands opposed to our direct experience. Speaking of our direct experience of the libertarian freedom to actively think and take thoughts captive, as the Apostle Paul would say, most of us are quite aware of the different what it is like, the different phenomenological texture, and having a passive thought, e.g., when someone is talking to me, and an active thought, one to which I exercise my active power and choose to attend. The difference is self-evident to introspective awareness, and such awareness provides non-doxastic, internalist grounds for the proper basicality of one's belief that one has and can exercise active power. On this basis, I think that active power is epistemically, conceptually, and ontologically foundational and essential for there to be such things as knowledge of, a concept of, and the existence of libertarian acts. And it's on the basis of this account and knowledge of relevant moral features that we have the concept of moral responsibility. Sure, a passive cog might possess passive awareness, but one would never have active control of what one is aware of on this deterministic view. One would not possess the ability or the power to be more careful while thinking things through. One's level of so-called carefulness is also causally determined by untrustworthy antecedent conditions, end quote. But like I said, Dave uses libertarian language when he says we can trace the justification or lack thereof for our inferential beliefs right down to their foundation. No, you can't, Dave. That's utterly false, at least if determinism is true. That's only true if Dave is a free thinker in a libertarian sense, which is odd because I do think that Dave affirms that he is a libertarian free thinker, but he's just kind of here. He's doing this whole thing standing up for his determinist friends, or so it seems to me. He's trying to argue that determinism isn't a problem. But if mindless stuff or deceptive deities are exhaustively determining the entirety of Dave's mental activity, then Dave is not actively tracing anything. Rather, passive experiences of tracings are happening to him, right? And those are determined by mindless stuff or deceptive supernatural beings. Now, have I mentioned that this has all been explained to Dave before? And have I mentioned that Dave simply ignores it? I think I talked about this in our last video. But here's the bottom line. Mere awareness is not enough. David Pallmann owes us a response to what has already been offered to him on my website, or our website, the FreeThinking Ministries website, freethinkinc.org. So he owes us that much. It's been offered to him on the FreeThinking Ministries website, not to mention it's been published in the academic literature, not directly to Dave, but just this topic in general that he has not engaged at this point. But all Dave does is ignores it. He is pretending it's not there. So here's the thing. You got to have more than awareness. You got to have more than evidence. You got to have some power. You got to have some control. And JP Moreland and I were focused on the power necessary to evaluate evidence, specifically metaphysical and theological arguments that would eventually allow humans to attain truth about metaphysical and theological reality if we are careful and handle those God-given powers responsibly. You got to have more than mere awareness. You got to have some power. You got to have genuine active control to guide your thinking in search for truth. Otherwise, it's not your search for truth. You can't be a mere passive cog determined by mindless stuff or a deceptive deity. In fact, let me find this quote. Jim Slagle says this nicely in his book called The Epistemological Skyhook. And he says, quote, "The claim, recall, is that there must be an explanation for a belief. It must be a good explanation, and it must be my explanation. But if the determining factors are extrinsic to the individual, not to the belief, then it's difficult to see how it could be my explanation as opposed to just an explanation. In order for it to be my explanation, I have to accept it. If my acceptance is also determined by extrinsic forces, which would include God, then in what sense is it my explanation?" End quote. So what do you think of all that, Josh?
Well, sorry. No, I think I think you're making a lot of sense. Good defense, and it kind of goes back to what we were saying before. There's a lot more out there than what's being laid out in the video, right? So,
Yeah.
so to act like it's not is either disingenuous or just you don't know.
Yeah, it's either ignorance or deception, it seems to me.
Yeah, or a failure to adequately engage with those things in an attempt to make a video as
Right.
well. So sometimes you just make a video about what you're going to make a video about. I'm guilty of doing that sometimes. So it could be that. I don't know, but I hear you, and I think
Mhm.
you're laying out a strong case there.
Yeah.
To do so, if we weren't aware of the relevant facts, inferences, and relations, then we would simply not possess evidence. In that case, the resulting absence of justification owes to a lack of evidence and not to the fact that the inference was determined. The fact of the matter is that, for the evidentialist, justification is all about believing in accordance with the reasons available to the subject. And as long as these reasons can remain accessible to the subject given determinism, evidentialist epistemic justification survives even on determinism.
All right, stop.
A further concern.
So I want to say, great. What if these so-called reasons and the manner in which you think about these reasons, or the manner in which reasoning happens to you, as C.S. Lewis said, is all determined by mindless stuff or deceptive deities? So Dave here is conflating two different uses of the word reason. Dave says, as long as one is aware of reasons, all right, but this fails to understand that people engage in faulty reasoning all the time. Obviously, one of us is doing it here. One of us is engaged in faulty reasoning, and I'm explaining why it's Dave. One believes things for certain reasons, but that does not mean that one has reasoned properly. If determinism is true, even if Dave is aware of the reasons as to why he holds a specific metaphysical belief, right? Let's suppose it's a false belief that Dave is determined to think is objectively justified. I mean, after all, most people believe that Dave is not infallible when it comes to metaphysics. So ultimately, then, the reason as to why Dave holds said metaphysical belief is because either mindless stuff determined Dave to hold this belief, or a deceptive deity determined him to affirm the belief. Dave might be passively aware of his reasons, but that does not mean that he has reasoned correctly. Indeed, he has not actively reasoned at all if this deterministic view is true. Reason is passively happening to him if determinism is true. Now, as JP Moreland and I have explained in our academic journal article, if David Pallmann is an intelligently designed free-thinking agent created in the likeness of a maximally great being, God, with cognitive faculties functioning properly, subject to no dysfunction in an appropriate environment, which can be aimed at truth if Dave, as an agent, is careful and handles his powers responsibly. Then the reason Dave affirms false metaphysical beliefs is likely because he's not being careful and he's not handling his powers responsibly. His metaphysical errors are on him. It's Dave's fault that he is missing the metaphysical mark all over the place. Thus, he should be ashamed because Dave had the power to be more careful, but he failed to do so. So ultimately, if one's metaphysical and theological beliefs are determined by antecedent conditions, that should not be trusted to determine humanity to affirm true metaphysical and theological beliefs, then there's reason to doubt how you've reasoned. You did not actively reason at all. It's an exercise in self-destruction. But this defeater to one's so-called use of reason exists, or if this defeater exists, then one does not possess justification for their ensuing beliefs. So Dave can say that justification is all about believing in accordance with reason. And I would agree, but that depends upon what one means by reason. Reasoning does not happen to us. We do it, right? C.S. Lewis made that clear in the 1940s, and Moreland and I explained exactly why Lewis was right in 2022. But if Pallmann is right, and reasoning can merely happen to us, like catching a cold, then he does not have the justification he claims to possess. Pallmann says, as long as these reasons can remain accessible to the subject, given determinism, I think he says evidentialist epistemic justification survives on determinism. But we've got to ask, what do you mean by accessible to the agent, Dave? Do you mean that the agent is piloting the ship and has the power to choose to access these reasons and also think carefully about these reasons, not to mention to reconsider the manner in which one had previously reasoned? If so, then I agree. But that's libertarian free thinking, and Dave makes my case for me. But if Dave says that these sensations of accessing reasons happens to me, and it's exhaustively determined by mindless stuff or deceptive deities, then this does nothing to help Dave's case. He still loses justification, and he jumps out of the frying pan and directly into the fryer. So think about this. Okay. When Dave says, I reject the free thinking argument, what does he mean by I? Is this I, in which Dave refers the source of this rejection of the free thinking argument, or is the rejection of the argument determined by non-rational and mindless stuff or a deceptive deity, right? If it's the former, then Dave is a libertarian free thinker. And if it's the latter, a defeater is raised against this rejection of the free thinking argument. So it's heads I win, tails you lose. This is because it's ultimately self-defeating to argue that untrustworthy antecedent conditions determine the entirety of your mental activity. What do you think, Josh?
All right. I think you kind of went through it all there. I had a question and then it just flew out of my mind.
Maybe I answered it as you were thinking about this.
Possibly that was the case. I'm trying to look through here to remember if maybe I should write it down when it occurs to me. Anyway, it must not have been that important since I don't remember it.
Hate it when that happens.
Yeah, but all of that to say, it seems to me he does leave that door open to say if you can, and I think what you're doing is proving, well, I don't think you can, right?
Well, saying I can access X means that
Yeah,
I am the one doing it. It's otherwise, as Moreland and I explained, something else is determining you to experience sensations of accessings. But you're in no control of anything. And that, as we explain in our paper, provides a huge defeater to one's metaphysical and theological beliefs.
yeah. All right, we are going to get into transcendental concerns now. So
Okay.
a little bit of a shift, but he's shifting this as well. So let's take a listen.
Which I have about Stratton's defense of his third premise is that the argument he offers in support of it is a transcendental argument. Transcendental arguments are a particular species of deductive arguments. As Robert Stern explains, transcendental arguments are usually said to be distinctive in involving a certain sort of claim, namely that for Y to be possible, X must be the case, where Y is some indisputable fact about us or our mental life. These sorts of arguments can be divided into what are called modest transcendental arguments and ambitious transcendental arguments. Modest transcendental arguments merely attempt to show that we must believe some proposition in order to be consistent with some other proposition, but they stop short of claiming that the proposition which must be believed is actually true. Whereas ambitious transcendental arguments try to take a further step and claim not merely that we must believe the proposition to be true, but also that it is actually true. Stratton's free thinking argument is a type of ambitious transcendental argument. My concern is that ambitious transcendental arguments principally cannot establish the truth of their conclusions. This means that even if my concerns voiced above can be given satisfactory answers, and it is true that rationality requires libertarian freedom, it would not follow that libertarian freedom actually exists. The only conclusion that would follow is that we must believe that we have libertarian freedom if we are going to believe that we are being rational. But that leaves the question open regarding whether or not we actually are rational, and therefore whether or not we actually are free in the libertarian
Okay,
sense.
stop.
Being constrained to believe something is
What are we doing right now? Right, Dave and I
Yeah.
are engaged in a rational conversation, trying to infer truth about metaphysical reality. So if Dave rationally infers that we do not have the power to rationally infer truth about metaphysical reality, then Dave has provided evidence that he does have the power to rationally infer truth about ultimate reality. This is why I've written in the literature that Pallmann ignores that it's self-defeating to argue against the pivotal premise, right? If one argues against it, he affirms it. Now, one is free to simply assert that it's false, apart from argument, but who cares about baseless assertions here? The fourth premise, it might be false, but it's impossible to rationally argue against it. And that seems to be pretty strong reason to accept it. It's like someone saying, perhaps humanity is completely confused and 2 + 2 does not really equal 4. Okay, maybe that's possible. Have fun making that case. It's so obvious that humans can do basic math that we have, speaking of math, 0 reasons to think we cannot do basic math. Indeed, the truth of this premise is more intuitively obvious than the existence of the physical universe. I mean, after all, one might rationally infer that idealism is true and that we actually exist in some kind of a matrix-like world, and that the physical universe does not actually exist in the manner in which we experience it. But it's impossible, right? Right. Look, I mean, people do, they rationally infer that idealism is true and that the physical universe doesn't really exist. But it's impossible to rationally infer that one never rationally infers. Right? Let me say that again. It's impossible to rationally infer that one never rationally infers. Right? That's like saying no one ever speaks English or no one ever watches YouTube videos. Well, what are you doing right now? You're watching a YouTube video of a guy speaking English. Thus, the very fact that you're watching a YouTube video in English counts as evidence against these odd assertions. So the mere fact that we're having this rational conversation right now provides the evidence we need to support the truth of this pivotal premise. Moreover, logically deductive arguments do not require 100% certainty of each premise. The premise must be seen as probably true before advancing to the next step. So in the paper I read just a few weeks ago, you were there, Josh, at the Evangelical Philosophical Society conference in San Antonio. We've got it right here on this YouTube channel. Let me quote a part of it here. I'm talking about this pivotal premise. And I say, quote, "This premise is affirmed by most people, and to rationally argue against the premise or to engage in any form of reasoning really is to assume it. Indeed, the premise is so intuitively obvious, so basic a belief, so intimate and dear and beneficial to us that we doubt that anybody, except perhaps the most dramatic of skeptics, would deny it without a passionate struggle. When faced with a choice between either 1, the reliability of our rational processes, or 2, determinism, It seems rational that determinism should be the one discarded. Therefore, we have rational grounds to affirm this premise. It follows from the premises, then, that humans have libertarian freedom and that determinism is false. End quote. So all that to say, we have provided really good reasons to affirm each step of the free thinking argument. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I think so, and I think too, and I'm not just saying that. And I think too, one of the questions that he raises in the video is, it doesn't have to be, if the argument works, it doesn't necessarily prove that libertarian free will is true. It just proves that we just need to believe that it's true in order to get there. And so I guess the question that I would have in response is, what does it mean to believe that it's true? Then as well, right? We just need to believe that it's true. Again, like you said, borrows from the libertarian language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going. So he's gonna keep talking about the transcendental concerns here, and we'll stop it as you need to.
Is no proof that it is true. Now, in his main argument, Stratton does include a premise stating that humans have the ability to rationally infer knowledge, but his defense of this premise is likewise transcendental. He argues that one cannot deny it without affirming it. And while this is, of course, quite true, it is possible to be skeptical of it without affirming it. Moreover, it principally does not establish that humans...
All right, so that's false. And not only is what Dave's saying false, he's also attacking a straw man. Now, I do not claim that one cannot deny it without affirming it. I explain that one cannot rationally argue against it, and that's far different, Dave. So David Pallmann here continues to show that he has not been careful while thinking about this argument. And I've told him that in the past too. I said, Dave, you're not being careful. And his response was literally, you're not being careful. And I'm like, okay, how can we have this rational conversation? It's not, it's anything but Dave continues to show that he's not been careful while thinking about this argument. Not to mention many other arguments, like the moral argument. Let me point people to the FreeThinking Ministries website, freethinkinc.org. That's freethinkinc.org, to see the article I wrote called Objective Morality versus David Pallmann. Anyway, I digress. Regarding the free thinking argument, Dave is now moving the goalposts, right? The argument is not that one cannot be skeptical of the premise. People are skeptical of the premises all the time, right? The argument is that one cannot be that one cannot rationally argue against the premise. Thus, if that's the case, then one cannot be rationally skeptical of the premise. So Dave is free to be irrationally skeptical. I think he is, but that misses the point. But like I said, one can refuse to affirm it, but then they are essentially saying that they have no rational reason not to affirm it. They are admitting their own irrationality. Now, I got to say, Dave should know better here. I sincerely think this move is often made by folks who should otherwise know better, but they let their emotional reasons get in the way, which is their fault if I'm right about libertarian free thinking. They don't have to do this. Now, perhaps they failed to actively bracket their biases or their own personal feelings about Tim Stratton. I don't know. But I think this is the case because almost everyone who has opposed the free thinking argument online, for some weird reason, they always seek to discredit me as a scholar or seek to attack my character first. It's really weird. And I just say, okay, let's just assume I'm the worst scholar in the world. I don't care. That's probably true. I'm just, I like to say I'm just a youth pastor who stumbled into apologetics, who then got into systematic theology because I was trying to defend the faith of my kids. So as a former youth pastor, I got into this academic world through the back door. It wasn't even really trying. And so I'm sure I make all kinds of mistakes as far as scholarship goes. And let's just suppose I'm a really bad person too, that I have nefarious motives. Let's suppose all of that. Is the argument sound? That's what matters. But people just want to attack my scholarship or Tim Stratton's character, and it's really creepy. But if one despises Tim Stratton so much that they're willing to affirm their own irrationality in an attempt to discredit an argument I've advanced, then I can't help them. and neither can anybody else. It's really mind-blowing to see some so-called Christians behave like this. I mean, literally, it's crazy. By definition, it seems crazy. That's the kind of mentality we would expect to see of the citizens of hell, not those who are citizens of the kingdom of God. So that might be extreme, but I think that's, we would expect that from those in hell, not from those who are following Christ. So let me just say, stay reasonable. Don't reject the pivotal premise of the free thinking argument, no matter how much you don't like Tim Stratton, the person. Indeed, all people should affirm this pivotal premise, and you just look silly when you fail to affirm it. And I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to help you not look silly. What do you think, Josh? Have I crossed any lines here?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I didn't. I don't know that I would.
Maybe I have.
I get what you're saying about the citizens of hell. My reasoning that way, because it seems dishonest to reason that way, or it, not seems, it is dishonest to reason that way, and also to disagree with a person rather than an argument seems odd. But people do that all the time, and so we point that out to them and say, well, you know, if you don't like me, that's fine, but but what am I saying that is wrong? And I think the reason you're bringing this up, and I think it's important, is even in his own video, in this particular section, Dave says, well, yeah, he's right, but you could be skeptical of it.
Not rationally skeptical.
Yeah, but it seems to me that you didn't necessarily, like, what's the point of going down that route, saying you can't throw any. My thought is, why can't you even throw one bone if you're having a conversation like this? Say, you know what, actually this one's fine, let's move on to the next one. He's right, you can't rationally argue against this one. It's like trying to say, and this is what he's kind of done the whole video, even with the premises he agrees with. He says, well, it's fine for me right now. You know, it's like, that's fine. To kind of tear down just the reasoning behind the whole argument.
Yeah.
And then on top of it, arguing with the oldest version of it.
Right.
As well. So let's keep going here.
Actually can rationally infer knowledge claims. At best, it only establishes that we must believe that we can do this on pain of contradicting ourselves. He says that it is properly basic that some humans do possess the ability to make these evaluative and rational judgments. In fact, if one objects to this premise, he or she seems to actually be affirming the same premise. In other words, if there were a successful argument for global skepticism, this would imply that knowledge has been gained, and therefore that global skepticism is false. However, I am not convinced that skepticism can be so easily dismissed. For even though it is certainly true that no one could deny knowledge without making a knowledge claim, this does not mean that anyone actually knows anything at all. In other words, there is a distinction between the knowability.
Does Dave know that? Or is it a baseless assertion? Right? Again, Dave is appealing to knowing things about metaphysics and epistemology while saying it's possible that we might not know anything about metaphysics and epistemology. Again, Dave is engaged in a self-destructive argument, but he seems completely oblivious to that fact.
It seems like taking it again one step too far to say, well, it doesn't mean that anyone knows anything. Okay, well, but if we're going to say, well, it could be possible that no one knows anything, then it isn't reasonable to have a discussion about anything. We can't actually have conversations. So as soon as you get out of this ethereal plane of, well, maybe no one knows anything, into actual conversation, you actually have to come face to face with reality, right?
Yeah. I mean, think about the absurdity of this. Dave saying it's possible that no one knows anything, and everybody should watch my YouTube channel so they can see what I know about metaphysics and epistemology. and if Dave's going to say it's possible I don't know anything, then why should anybody care what he says?
Yeah, well, and I don't, and clearly I don't think he actually believes that. And he's saying he doesn't actually believe that.
Well, he's saying that it's possible. He's arguing for the mere possibility of it.
He's saying, and he's saying that this argument doesn't make it impossible for people to not know things, or I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I don't see how that follows. It just seems to me to say, to kind of throw up your hands because you don't want that particular reasoning to be justified. So you say, well, I mean, it could be that nobody knows anything. How do we prove that people know something? So anyway, I digress. Any more thoughts on that?
No, let's just keep going.
All right.
Of skepticism and the thesis of skepticism. As Barry Stroud says, if the set of beliefs we attribute to ourselves and others enjoy as a whole the kind of invulnerability I have identified, these allegedly skeptical possibilities can represent no threat to our beliefs. We should not find ourselves massively mistaken in the beliefs we can recognize ourselves as holding. Error of that cosmic scope is not something we could discover to be so, consistently with continuing to ascribe and to think of ourselves as possessing the beliefs in question. If there is a certain invulnerability against philosophical skepticism here, it does not amount to anything as strong as a denial of what skepticism says. Philosophical skepticism says that we do not know certain things that we think we know. To show that that is false would be to show that we do know those things. The kind of invulnerability I have in mind does not imply that we do know them. It does not imply that we know the things in question, and it does not imply that they are true. It does not imply that the beliefs in question are indispensable to any conception of an independent world. It does not even say that the beliefs in question are invulnerable in the sense that we could never or never reasonably give them up. What it implies about invulnerable beliefs is that we could never see ourselves as holding the beliefs in question and be mistaken. While it is quite true that no one could ever know that skepticism is true, this fact does not do anything to refute skepticism as such. It could still be true that no one possessed any knowledge at all, even if no one could know that this was the case. Indeed,
Stop.
if skepticism were true, then we would not.
I can hear the words of Frank Turek ringing through my ears. Is that true? You know, speaking of Frank Turek, just had the opportunity to contribute to a book called Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions, Essays in Honor of Frank Turek, and had the opportunity to write a chapter in that book that gets us into these topics. But, you know, what Dave is saying there, I would have to ask what he's claiming there. He says, this fact does not do anything to refute skepticism, but it could, as such, it could still be true that no one possessed any knowledge. Well, is that a claim of knowledge about epistemology that Dave is advancing? And if so, then we know that we can, in fact, gain knowledge about metaphysics and epistemology. If it's false, and Dave cannot possess knowledge about metaphysics and epistemology, then he's wasted his time making his video, and no one should take him seriously or care about his opinions on this matter. Anything else you want to say on that, Josh?
Yeah, I don't. That's the thing. I don't think. Obviously, I don't think he actually believes that skepticism is true in that sense. And I suppose what he's saying, so I'm trying to be as generous as possible here. So I suppose what he's saying is that premise of the argument, since it's transcendental, doesn't actually hold the power to refute skepticism. But I don't see that. Even the quote that he offers, I can't remember who the quote was by. Even the quote that he offers, I don't think it's necessarily addressing what you're claiming there. So, so it seems to me an odd foray into this argumentation. I don't know. Maybe and again, I'm just a layman, so maybe I'm off. But yeah, anything to say about that?
No, I guess just what I already said. Yeah, I think that he's missing the mark there. By the way, do you have Dave's video at regular speed, or is it sped up?
It's at 1.5.
Oh, is it? Okay.
1.5. Do you want me to speed it up more?
All right. No, it's probably good like that.
Okay.
Just wondering. Okay.
Yep.
Let's keep it going.
Okay.
Not expect anyone to know it, but this fact hardly provides evidence against the possible truth of skepticism. Thus, the mere fact that no one can claim to know that skepticism is true is not damaging to the skeptical thesis. The bottom line is that skepticism is not inherently self-refuting, even if a claim to know it is epistemically self-defeating. Hence, a refutation of skepticism is still required to justify Stratton's fourth premise. Showing that skepticism cannot be justifiably believed is insufficient to show that skepticism is false.
All right,
And
stop.
here we reach the crux of the problem with Stratton's transcendental argument.
Here's the thing. You know, I guess I don't really care to convince folks who do not think it's possible to know things about metaphysics and epistemology, right? Not my target audience, right? These folks are so few, hardly anyone who actually engages in rational debate will affirm that they are not rational agents who can know things about metaphysics and epistemology. I'd say that over 99% of the folks I engage know via direct awareness that the pivotal premise of my argument is true. Right? Those are the folks I'm seeking to persuade with the argument for libertarian freedom. I mean, this is really absurd. Like I said, it's close to crazy to say that it's not possible to infer and attain best explanations about metaphysics. Well, then you're wasting your time then, and you don't know what you just said. So the folks, I mean, hardly in all, I've been defending this argument for 12 years. I can count the number of people on one hand who have rejected that pivotal premise. And I don't think any of them were scholars. Most of them were atheists who wanted so badly to avoid the conclusion. Most of them were determinists who wanted so bad, atheist determinists who wanted so badly to avoid the conclusion that after I defended the first three premises and they couldn't argue that, the only one left for them to do was to say, well, I'm skeptical of premise 4. And I said, well, you're not rationally skeptical of it. So anyway, Pallmann is free to tell his audience that he's skeptical of what he claims to know, including all of his claims of knowledge in this video that we're responding to. But that certainly will not help him gain subscribers. In fact, I would tell people, why would you subscribe to a YouTube personality whose focus is on metaphysics and epistemology and things like that, who also says, I don't know if we can know anything about metaphysics and epistemology. In fact, that should be the last person you should waste your time watching. So let's keep it going.
Yeah, so I think he's going to get to why he gets into this here in a little bit. And again, I don't think we're saying that we actually believe that Dave thinks that skepticism is true. Perhaps he has an argument specifically that he thinks refutes it. He thinks your argument doesn't refute it. Is that fair to say?
Well, again, Dave, I believe, is a libertarian, right? He believes he's a free thinker in a libertarian sense. What he's doing is standing up for his determinist friends, whether they be naturalist determinists or divine determinists, and saying, no, it's possible for these guys, even though I'm not one of them, it's still possible for them to have everything that I'm arguing and saying they can't have. So he's saying that my argument fails, even though he holds to libertarian free thinking for different reasons that he hasn't made clear in this video. So by doing that, he's saying that it's possible that naturalistic atheistic determinism is true. It's possible. It's possible for divine determinism to be true. And everything that I'm arguing for does not scathe those things. And I'm saying, not so fast. My argument is sound, it's successful, and it shows that with all things being considered, both atheistic naturalistic determinism and divine determinism are false. And so let's keep going.
Yeah. So I do think that's an important thing to point out, that as he's attacking, and this is why it gets hard in this video, because if he just attacked the argument, I think it would be a little bit easier to have these conversations, but he attacks the person and the argument. And so it kind of goes back and forth there. But I think it is important for us to acknowledge, like you just did, that what he's saying is your argument doesn't actually refute these things. And what you're saying is, in the responses that I've heard you say, is no, it does. but what it seems he wants to do is say, no, don't worry, my friends who are determinists, don't worry, Tim Stratton is not a threat to you. Is that
Yeah. Yeah, I think
right?
that's fair. Mhm.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
If Stratton refutes skepticism, then he will have done so by proving the reality of knowledge. But if this is accomplished, then it seems that libertarian freedom is not needed for knowledge. Perhaps Stratton could refute skepticism by proving knowledge of libertarian freedom. But this seems unlikely, since his argument for libertarian freedom requires the reality of knowledge to already be established in premise 4, and therefore the reality of knowledge cannot be used to refute skepticism. Perhaps
All
he
right,
could prove
hold on a
knowledge of
second.
libertarian freedom.
Hold on a second. The argument starts by showing what is essential for rationality and metaphysical knowledge. Being free to think, free from untrustworthy antecedent conditions, sufficient to necessitate the entirety of human mental activity. So, if this is the case, if we really can rationally infer truth about metaphysical matters, which seems self-evident to most people, then we know we have libertarian freedom. We are free to think, free from untrustworthy antecedent conditions sufficient to necessitate the entirety of human mental activity, including all of our metaphysical thoughts and beliefs. So, since we all experience the direct awareness that we can know things about metaphysics, like I said, David Pallmann has an entire YouTube channel devoted to that endeavor. And to attempt to rationally argue against this idea affirms it, right? You can be irrationally skeptical all you want, but in the attempt to rationally argue against this idea affirms it, then we know that or at least we have really good reason to believe that our thoughts and beliefs are not determined by mindless stuff or deceptive deities. So that's all I got to say about that part.
So is it kind of a two birds, one stone deal?
Oh, yeah.
He's saying, well, you either have to prove knowledge before you can affirm libertarian free will, or you have to prove libertarian free will before you can prove knowledge. But then that would require knowledge. So what he's saying is, it doesn't hold up because if you prove one before the other, that means you can have knowledge without libertarian free will. But in order to prove libertarian free will, you have to have knowledge. So that's why the argument doesn't work. And what I hear you saying is actually it's a two birds, one stone. You get both, two for the price of one. Is that fair? Or am I missing something there?
Um, I would just say it goes step by step. Our argument goes step by step, and it's sound. It's valid. It's been examined by multiple philosophers who are pretty, one in particular who is an expert at symbolic logic. He's gone above and beyond to make sure that it's not begging questions. So yeah, you just go step by step. And you know what? I'm going to have a lot more to say about this as we listen to the rest of the video. So let's keep it rolling.
All right. Sorry to jump the gun there. Yeah, let's keep going.
To another argument. But in that case, the free thinking argument becomes unnecessary since libertarian freedom could be established without it. None of these options end in Stratton's favor as far as I can see. I have now detailed at some length why I believe that the third premise of the argument is, at the very least, unjustified and probably false. That project was largely defensive, intended to show that Stratton has not done the work necessary to justify the key premise of his argument. But now I want to switch gears
why
and
it
take
was
an
wrong.
offensive against his argument by arguing that there is a fundamental inconsistency between the
we showed, I think showing why he was wrong, and also showing that that third premise is completely reworded in the most recent literature. So
That's right.
You got more work to do.
Yep.
third and fourth premises of his argument, such that if the third premise is true, then the fourth premise is false. And conversely, if the fourth premise is true, then the third premise is false. It is important to emphasize that throughout this next section, I will not be challenging the truth of the fourth premise of the argument. As I have already pointed out, I reject the third premise of the argument. I am merely trying to point out that if someone affirms the third premise, then they cannot simultaneously affirm the fourth premise. In other words, the third and fourth premise are in conflict with one another. My argument runs as follows. 1. If one cannot be epistemically justified in believing that the
All right. Before we let Dave continue, let's educate the audience, everybody following along here, as to what these premises say in the recent version advanced by J.P. Moreland and me in our article called An Explanation and Defense of the Free Thinking Argument. Again, Dave has ignored the recent literature on this and is attacking an old man and thus, in a sense, attacking a straw man. But here's how Moreland and I offered one version of the argument. We said, premise one, if humanity does not possess the libertarian freedom to think, then humanity is never epistemically responsible. 2, humanity is occasionally epistemically responsible. 3, therefore, humanity possesses the libertarian freedom to think. And as Jacobus Erasmus and I have advanced it in the 2023 paper that we presented at the Evangelical Philosophical Society, it goes like this. Premise one, if human beings lack libertarian freedom, then their rational processes are unreliable to attain truth about metaphysical matters. 2, human beings' rational processes are reliable to attain truth about metaphysical matters. 3, therefore, human beings have libertarian freedom. So it's like arguing in this manner. You could say premise one, if I'm tied up, gagged, and sitting in the back seat, then I'm not driving. But look, I am driving. Therefore, I'm not tied up, gagged, and sitting in the back seat. So Dave wants to say that premise one and premise two are in conflict, but that's not how reasoning works, right? More specifically, it'd be like this. Premise one, if I'm always tied up, gagged, and sitting in the back seat, then I never drive. Premise two, but I occasionally drive. I know that much. I have direct awareness of that much. 3, therefore, I'm not always tied up, gagged, and sitting in the back seat. So there's no inconsistency here. Here's another one. 1, if determinism is true, then I have no active control over any of my thought life. 2, I'm directly aware that I have some active control over some of my thought life. 3, therefore, determinism is false. Or 1, if determinism is true, the entirety of human mental activity is completely passive. 2, I actively take thoughts captive, 2 Corinthians 10:5. 3, therefore, determinism is false. So, after Dave released his video, Jacobus Erasmus emailed me and wrote out, I mentioned him earlier, but yeah, he emailed me and wrote out the entire syllogism in the form of symbolic logic. The dude dreams in symbolic logic. He's crazy. But he ended his email saying, the free thinking argument is clearly valid, end quote. So in fact, it's not just Erasmus. It's, John DePoe and I also discussed this over email after Pallmann released his video. And DePoe not only said that the free thinking argument is sound, which means it's also valid, he said that he's willing to be a guest right here on this show to explain it in more depth and detail. So stay tuned for that.
All right, let's there's not much more to be added to that. There is much more, but we'll wait for Dr. DePoe to add to it. So let's go with he goes on the offensive here. And let's listen through the argument, and perhaps you'll stop in the middle of it, but
I might stop after each premise. So
okay,
let's see.
Sounds good.
Necessary conditions for epistemic justification obtain, then one cannot rationally believe that any of their beliefs are epistemically justified. 2, epistemic justification can be either probabilistic, inferential, or certain. 3, if libertarian free will is a necessary condition for epistemic justification, then the belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be justified probabilistically or inferentially. 4, the belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be justified with certainty. 5, libertarian free will is a necessary condition for epistemic justification. 6, therefore, the belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be epistemically justified. 7, therefore, one cannot be epistemically justified in believing that any of their beliefs are epistemically justified.
All right,
now,
stop.
Obviously, I am going to escape the conclusion.
All right, so I decided to let him go all the way through. Okay, so I've got his argument typed out here. So he says, premise 1, if one cannot be epistemically justified in believing that the necessary conditions for epistemic justification obtain, then one cannot rationally believe that any of their beliefs are epistemically justified. And I would say, okay, but it should be noted that since 2022, the free thinking argument is laser focused on metaphysical beliefs. So perhaps one can rationally believe that their wife is baking bread in the kitchen but that's not a metaphysical belief. His premise 2, he says epistemic justification can either be probabilistic, inferential, or certain. And my response to that is, again, I just want to get clarity on what kinds of things Dave is talking about here. Is he talking about geographical beliefs, for example? Or is he on the same page with me and discussing metaphysical beliefs? We got to get on the same page before we can really make advancements here. Premise 3, I'll let that pass. Premise 4, the belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be justified with certainty. Okay. But the libertarian freedom to think is deductively concluded from a valid and sound deductive argument. So we've got that much. His premise 5 says libertarian free will is a necessary condition for epistemic justification. And I would say false, at least as it's worded, false. He has some more unpacking to do. 6, he says, therefore, the belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be epistemically justified, and that's only true if logically deductive conclusions don't count as epistemic justification. I would say that they do. So I think his argument here is just a colossal failure. Now he goes on, and I think he just said that he wants to reject the 5th premise, but he back it up just a little bit. I think he says he wants to reject the 5th premise. Let me see if that's true.
All right. Yeah. So this is where we're at. So he does say he rejects the 5th premise right here. He has a line through it.
Okay. Yeah. And I would say I would reject the premise as well as it's written. Again, what's frustrating is, Dave even in his video says that we're friends. I really wanted to help him several years ago. I even offered to share my platform with him. But again, for some weird reason, he is turned on me and he's not friendly to me whatsoever. And I think that's pretty obvious to anybody that watches his video. But he does have my phone number. I've tried to communicate with him even in the last year. But Dave really should have called me before making this video. I invited him to call me to discuss these things several months ago, maybe a year ago, but it never happened. But if he doesn't want clarification from the horse's mouth in a phone call, he should have at least read the 2022 paper I wrote with Moreland. And if he has read it, he should have read it more slowly and more carefully. Sometimes I think Dave is so concerned about speed reading that he might miss some important things along the way, which leads him to espouse false metaphysical and theological beliefs because he was not as careful as he could have been, not as careful as he should have been. But Dave also needs to surround himself with others who are not blind by their unhealthy dislike of Tim Stratton. All of the folks who Dave said proofread his script fall into that category, the script for the video that we're now critiquing. They're pretty much guaranteed to all fail to be objective and provide Dave with good advice. So when those who surround you are committed to the proposition that Tim Stratton must be wrong before they even read my current work, then they will seek to find problems when problems aren't there. And this has become painfully obvious after watching Dave's video. It's like, Josh, you and I talk about the problems of critical race theory and wokeness and all that kind of stuff quite often. But this reminds me of critical race theory. You start critical race theory, which starts with the assumption that racism must be there. So now everything you see is infected with racism, even when racism is not there. And so then every white person must be racist. They were born that way. And then when I respond, but I'm not racist, they'll say, see, that's evidence of your racism. I digress.
Your white fragility.
That's my white fragility. Yep.
Yes.
So anyway, this is a similar kind of thing. Tim Stratton has got to be wrong. So as soon as you look at the argument, even if it's something co-authored with J.P. Moreland, well, it's got to be wrong. It's just got to be. So you look for problems, even when problems aren't there. Anyway, Dave, since you have failed to carefully engage all of my work, I'm sure this is going to come as a surprise, but I also reject the fifth premise. Libertarian free thinking is only a necessary condition for epistemic justification if the antecedent conditions, which would otherwise be sufficient to necessitate the entirety of human mental activity, are mindless or deceptive or just plain random. All right. Now, did I mention that J.P. Moreland and I made this clear in our paper? We discuss each of those. Anyway, this offensive attack offered by Pallmann here is utterly impotent. It's a waste of time, as I reject the same premise he rejects. So let's keep going.
All right.
Conclusion of this argument by rejecting the fifth premise. But presumably the defender of the free thinking argument wants to maintain premise 5 as it is nearly identical to Stratton's premise 3, for otherwise they have to reject the free thinking argument.
I'm going to pause it there. Is it identical, nearly identical to premise 3 of the argument as he listed?
Okay, well, the way it's worded, it's close, but the way we unpack it in the literature explains, okay, once you have, if you're going to say that antecedent conditions are sufficient to determine the manner in which you judge and evaluate evidence, then you show that that these antecedent conditions, whether you're an atheist, a naturalist, divine determinist, Calvinist, whatever, then those are going to be untrustworthy antecedent conditions. Now, that's when libertarian freedom becomes necessary, when the source of your thoughts and beliefs and the manner in which you deliberate, when there's reason to see, or when there's reason to doubt that the source is trustworthy, or if there's reason to believe that the source is trustworthy to cause you to affirm false metaphysical beliefs, then that's when you need to be free from those antecedent conditions. And one of the things that J.P. Moreland and I demonstrated is that your beliefs, or the entirety of your thoughts and beliefs on metaphysics and theology, are determined by non-rational and mindless stuff, and therefore untrustworthy. They're determined by a deity of deception or some other deceptive supernatural being, and therefore untrustworthy. Completely random, and therefore untrustworthy. Or best option here is that they are determined by you, an intelligently designed and free-thinking agent created in the image and likeness of God, who's been given the power to infer better and best and true beliefs about metaphysics and theology, if you're careful and handle those God-given powers responsibly. But that if you're careful entails libertarian freedom, as we explain. So look, if Dave believes that God always determines, that a God of truth determines everybody to always affirm true metaphysical beliefs, well, surely he doesn't believe that, but one would be epistemically justified if that's the case. But as soon as as soon as a defeater has been raised against that being the case, then you don't have that justification anymore. Hope that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Hope that answers your question.
So could it be said that part of the reason he may reject premise 3 is that he doesn't, his understanding of it is of your reasoning behind it is actually based on a faulty understanding of what is meant. So if he says P3 in your argument, that is not worded that way anymore. But if he says P3 in your argument is basically the same as P5 in his argument, and he rejects P5 and you also reject P5, but you don't reject P3 in your previous argument, could you say that perhaps the reason he rejects P3 is because he doesn't actually understand what you mean by it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's because he's failed to engage the recent literature.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to clarify that up because he makes a statement there about the two being nearly identical.
Yeah. Again, I'm sure we're going to discuss this more as we go through his statements and his comments. So I'm just going to put a pause button on that right now. Let's just keep going, and I'll get to that soon.
All right.
Argument. However, why should the defender of the free thinking argument accept the other premises of this argument? Well, the first premise shouldn't be too controversial. After all, justified beliefs depend upon the necessary conditions for epistemic justification being met. For example, if you believe that Berlin is the capital of Germany, a necessary condition for this belief to be justified is that you are justified in believing that there is such a place as Germany in the first place. You could not possibly be justified in believing the proposition that Berlin is the capital of Germany if you were not already justified in believing the proposition
All right,
that
stop.
Germany exists. So similarly, if libertarian free will
Sorry,
is a
there we go.
Yeah, Dave needs to stick with the topic. Germany and Berlin are geographical locations with governed borders. Moreland and I are specifically discussing metaphysical and theological beliefs, not beliefs about geography. So Dave's thought experiment here is not relevantly analogous. Let's roll it.
All right.
Necessary condition for justifiably believing any other proposition, as Tim Stratton wants to maintain, then we would have to be justified in believing that libertarian free will obtains before we could be justified in believing anything else. If this is right, then we have to be justified in believing in libertarian free will before we can justifiably believe in literally any other proposition.
Stop.
If we
Stop,
believe
stop.
some other proposition.
That's false. That's not how epistemology works, Dave. You cannot have a defeater raised against your metaphysical and epistemic beliefs. If you think you're determined by antecedent conditions that are sufficient to necessitate only true beliefs about ultimate reality, then keep on believing in determinism, or even that it's possible. However, if your beliefs entail that the entirety of your mental activity is either determined by mindless stuff or deceptive deities, then at the least, you have reason to doubt your metaphysical beliefs, including those under discussion right now. So here comes that dead horse again. JP Moreland and I are, we highlight this fact in the conclusion of our paper. It's too bad that David Pallmann failed to address it in his video. So let's let him keep talking.
Position without first having justification for believing in libertarian freedom, then it might turn out that there is no libertarian freedom after all, and that, consequently, the original belief is unjustified. So the proponent of Stratton's argument seems to be committed to accepting the first premise of my argument. The second premise should also be fairly uncontroversial. If some belief is epistemically justified, then this just means that there is some reason, which is either guaranteeing that the belief is true, or at least making it more probably true than not. That's just what epistemic justification means. If a proposition is not certainly true, and not even probably true, then it is just not justified. So the second premise is true by definition. The third premise is where things begin to get interesting. The third premise asserts that if libertarian free will is a necessary condition for epistemic justification, then the belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be justified probabilistically. To see why this is so, consider what probabilistic justification consists in. To say that a proposition is probably true is to say that other justifiably believed propositions render it more likely true than false. Probabilities are always relative to something else. Some other justifiably believed propositions have to be making it more probably true than false. A proposition cannot be probably true all on its own, nor can it be probably true relative to unjustified propositions, for then there would be no justification to transmit. Some further propositions must be justifiably believed in order to tip the scales in favor of truth. As Timothy McGrew argues, to what body of evidence are epistemically probable claims related then? The natural answer is that, under all ordinary circumstances, they are related to our ostensible background knowledge, a set of beliefs which we take to be more or less unproblematic. This raises in an obvious, though informal way, the insufficiency of moderate foundationalism. When the stock of relatively unproblematic beliefs is exhausted by the regress, there is nothing left to confer high epistemic probability on the basic beliefs. Hence, any version of foundationalism that appeals to the high epistemic probability of its basic beliefs is doomed from the outset. Epistemic probability cannot accrue from nothing. Here is where we run into the major problem for Stratton. Any further beliefs to which one might appeal in order to render their belief that libertarian free will obtains probable will themselves need to be justified. However, given premises 1 and 5, those supporting beliefs cannot themselves be justified until one has already justified their belief that libertarian free will obtains. Remember, given premise 1 and premise 5, libertarian free will is necessary for epistemic justification. Together, these premises entail that one must justifiably believe that they have libertarian free will before they can justifiably believe anything else. Hence, there is no possibility of using other beliefs to justify.
All right. You got to go deeper, Dave. Again, let me say, you're not being careful. What Moreland and I have exposed is that one must believe that mindless stuff or a deity of deception, right? Mindless stuff that knows nothing about metaphysics, right? Or a deity of deception is not exhaustively determining the entirety of your mental activity. That's what somebody's got to believe. You got to start with that. One is a libertarian free thinker if mindless, deceptive, untrustworthy, or any other antecedent conditions are insufficient to necessitate the entirety of one's mental activity. To reject this means that the entirety of the rejector's mental activity is, in fact, determined by mindless, deceptive, or untrustworthy antecedent conditions. Excuse me. But if that would be the case, then that's a defeater against their rejection. So look, one is free to believe in determinism and epistemic justification if, and only if, they also affirm that the laws and events of nature or the God of truth always determines him or her to affirm true metaphysical and theological beliefs. But as soon as one affirms that, they've got to hold, as soon as they affirm that they've got to hold at least one false theological belief. And anybody that takes this stuff seriously is going to say that. And if they're going to say, as soon as one affirms that they've got to have at least one false metaphysical or theological belief, and that, say, God determines them to affirm said false theological belief, now their house of cards is going to crumble. So that's why, Moreland and I, we offer 4 options that, given that the truth and human experience, that there's no PhD metaphysician, no Christ follower, no theologian who holds a perfect set of metaphysical and theological beliefs, and combine that with all these other deterministic options, then we offer what we call option 4, and we discuss this in our paper, that this is our best hope and the best explanation. But then we say, but option 4 entails that one is a libertarian free thinker. So anyway, Dave really missed the mark on this entire video. You can either comment on that, Josh, or we can let Dave continue.
No, the only thing I would say is, so what you offer now is a refutation of his assertion of 1 and 5 working together, and also a refutation of exhaustive divine determinism. Could he say, well, sure, that might refute exhaustive divine determinism, but it doesn't refute naturalistic determinism? Could he say that?
I mean, the problem is going to be on naturalistic determinism. All of his thoughts and his beliefs and his evaluations of the evidence and his judgments of the evidence and his experiences of reason is all determined by non-rational and mindless stuff, as Joshua Rasmussen has pointed out. Right? Mindless stuff that knows nothing about metaphysics is determining all of Pallmann's thoughts and beliefs about metaphysics. That's a defeater against his thoughts and beliefs about metaphysics.
Okay, I just wanted to get that in there. Sorry. Yeah. There you go.
Justify this belief that libertarian freedom obtains. No arguments can be constructed for the reality of libertarian freedom without begging the question. If libertarian freedom is a precondition for any justified beliefs, then all argumentation would assume libertarian freedom from the start, because all argumentation presupposes justified beliefs. Consequently, the third premise is true. There is no inferential way to justify the belief that libertarian free will obtains if libertarian free will is indeed necessary for the possibility of justified beliefs. But what about the fourth premise? Perhaps the defender of Stratton's argument would want to maintain that we can't actually know that libertarian free will obtains apart from any intervening arguments, but can instead know it directly and with certainty. This doesn't strike me as a very promising or plausible move. Even most believers in libertarian free will want to maintain that it is at least epistemically possible that determinism is true. For example, while alluding to this very sort of free-thinking argument, William Lane Craig acknowledges that determinism is epistemically possible, saying, determinism could be true, but it's very hard to see how it could ever be rationally affirmed. No one, to my knowledge, argues that we have some sort of logical proof against determinism or decisive evidence for libertarian free will.
All right,
false. Or stop. Argument wants to maintain that libertarian free.
First, he says William Lane Craig acknowledges that determinism is epistemically possible. No, William Lane Craig acknowledges that that it's possible that determinism is true. But then he goes on, as I do, and as J.P. Moreland does, to show that if that's the case, we couldn't rationally infer truths about metaphysics. All right, so he says it's Dave puts words in his mouth there and says that William Lane Craig acknowledges that determinism is epistemically possible.
Is that what he says?
I think that's what I
Should
just
we
heard him say.
rewind that?
Yeah,
I
do
don't
it.
remember. Let's rewind and see, because I don't want to.
Strike me as a very promising or plausible move. Even most believers in libertarian free will want to maintain that it is at least epistemically possible that determinism is true. For example, while alluding to this very sort of free thinking argument, William Lane Craig acknowledges that determinism is epistemically possible, saying,
Okay, that is what he says. He says William Lane Craig acknowledges that it is at least epistemically possible.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah. So, anyway, that's the first thing I wanted to point out there. And then Dave says that no one, to my knowledge, argues that we have some sort of logical proof against determinism or decisive evidence for libertarian free will. Well, there are a plethora of philosophers who affirm that the free thinking argument is sound. Thus, even if Dave does not want to call that the free thinking argument decisive evidence, many point out that we have logically deductive arguments concluding that humans possess libertarian freedom and arguments that show why naturalistic and divine determinism cannot be true. Now, Dave knows me, but I'm just a PhD theologian who affirms that much. And although he does not know J.P. Moreland personally, I don't think, JP also affirms this to be the case. One of the world's leading philosophers, right? Dr. Equibus Erasmus is also a PhD philosopher who affirms this to be the case. And as I mentioned earlier, Dr. John DePoe is an epistemologist who Dave looks up to, who also affirms the soundness of the free thinking argument. And many more are coming forward to endorse this. Angus Manouge is another one that comes to mind. He used to be the president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. Anyway, the free thinking argument, as advanced by Moreland and me, logically and deductively concludes, which I refer to as a logical proof, that both naturalistic determinism and divine determinism, both those views are false, and that humans are then free thinkers in the libertarian sense. So yeah, stay tuned for the forthcoming essay I'm co-authoring, which deductively demonstrates that both naturalistic determinism is false and that divine determinism is false. I do kill two birds with one stone.
There you go. The best way to hunt.
Yes.
All right. We good to keep going?
Yeah, keep it going.
Determinism could be true, but it's very hard to see how it could ever be rationally affirmed. No one, to my knowledge, argues that we have some sort of logical proof against determinism or decisive evidence for libertarian free will. And if the defender of Stratton's argument wants to maintain that libertarian free will is known non-inferentially and with certainty, then the free thinking argument becomes superfluous and pointless, since they would already know with certainty that they have libertarian freedom without this argument. Hence, in order to rescue the free thinking argument from my argument in this way.
I believe the right word is UGH. UGH. What we can know, I would say this, what we can know with certainty is that if mindless stuff or deceptive deities are in exhaustive control of the entirety of David Pallmann's mind, then the thoughts and comments flowing out of Dave's mouth are suspect. We have reason to doubt what spews out of David Pallmann's mouth, especially regarding metaphysical matters, such as those under discussion. Right? That's what we can know. Right? The free thinking argument is valid. That means the structure is correct. There's no assumings of libertarian freedom to conclude libertarian freedom. Simply look at the core of the argument. JP, let me get this here. This is the core of the argument that JP and I advanced as an individual syllogism. I think I said it earlier, but let me read it again. Premise 1. If humanity does not possess the libertarian freedom to think, then humanity is never epistemically responsible. 2. Humanity is occasionally epistemically responsible. 3. Therefore, humanity possesses the libertarian freedom to think. All right? That's sound. It's a valid argument. All right? That argument, let's rephrase it this way. Premise 1. If the entirety of human mental activity is determined by mindless stuff or deceptive supernatural beings, then humans have no control over how they think and indirectly what they ultimately believe about ultimate reality. 2, humans do have control over how they think and what they ultimately believe about ultimate reality, right? What we are doing right now is evidence of the truth of premise 2. Therefore, 3, The entirety of human mental activity is not determined by mindless stuff or deceptive supernatural beings. So really, rewind it, examine these arguments closely, no circular reasoning detected. In fact, the current paper I'm co-authoring advances an even more evolved and updated version of the free thinking argument in the form of symbolic logic, just to make sure no accusations of question begging stand. So stay tuned for that.
All right.
Way, the proponent of the free thinking argument will no longer be able to base his belief in libertarian freedom on the free thinking argument. But for anyone who does not take themselves to have absolute certainty that libertarian free will obtains, the fourth premise of my argument should be accepted as true. As we have already seen, the defender of the free thinking argument should want to affirm the fifth premise, since it merely states the principle, which undergirds the third premise of Stratton's argument.
Okay,
The
stop.
sixth premise just states the.
Just to be clear, as I've explained before, I reject P5 as Dave has written it, and I explained why. Thus, Dave's offensive argument here it doesn't pass. It's unsound. It's an unsound attempt at argumentation. On the other hand, given everything that Pallmann has argued for in his video here, although he's personally not a determinist for other reasons, as we've made clear, he is effectively defending the view that determinism is possible. With that in mind, here's an argument I recently offered to Dave. Now, I got to say, I typed this out. I was sitting on the beach in Mexico, typing on my phone with my thumbs, and typed this out. Let me read it here for you. It goes like this. Premise 1. If David Pallmann's beliefs about metaphysics and epistemology are true, right, everything he's discussed in this video, then human mental activity can be exhaustively determined by non-rational and mindless antecedent conditions that know nothing of metaphysics and epistemology. Premise 2. If David Pallmann's mental activity is exhaustively determined by non-rational and mindless stuff that knows nothing of metaphysics and epistemology, then David Pallmann does not freely think in a libertarian sense. That's true by definition. 3. If David Pallmann does not freely think in a libertarian sense, then he is not rationally responsible for his metaphysical and epistemological beliefs. Rather, non-rational and mindless stuff that knows nothing about metaphysics and epistemology is responsible for that much. 4. But David Pallmann is rationally responsible for his metaphysical and epistemological beliefs. And heck, if he's not, then no one should care about what he claims to know on his YouTube videos. 5. Therefore, David Pallmann freely thinks in a libertarian sense. 6. Therefore, David Pallmann's mental activity cannot be exhaustively determined by non-rational and mindless stuff that knows nothing of metaphysics and epistemology. 7. Therefore, David Pallmann's views on metaphysics and epistemology, everything he's discussed in his video, is false. David Pallmann's views on metaphysics and epistemology are false. Now, Dave has interacted a little bit with this argument that I shared with him while I was sitting on the beach, soaking up the sun in Mexico. And thus far, what I've seen, his attempt at escaping the final conclusion of this argument is by saying, he says that premise 1 is false. I am not personally a determinist. But this misses the point. The first premise does not say is, but rather can. Examine it closely. I said, if David Pallmann's beliefs about metaphysics and epistemology are true, then human mental activity can be exhaustively determined by non-rational and mindless antecedent conditions that know nothing of metaphysics and epistemology. So if he rejects this premise, then he provides a defeater against everything he said in his video against the free thinking argument. And if he affirms it, then we move on to the next step and ultimately to the deductive conclusion that David Pallmann's views on metaphysics and epistemology are false. So as I said earlier, it's heads I win, tails Pallmann loses. So either Pallmann should be more careful and choose to re-examine his current thoughts and beliefs, or no rational person should consider him an authority when it comes to metaphysics and epistemology. And believe me, that's the last thing David Pallmann wants. So in conclusion, David Pallmann has tried to explain why he doesn't use the free thinking argument when making a case for theism. In the process, however, he failed to engage the current literature on the topic and even failed to rigorously engage with my work that specifically addressed David Pallmann's concerns in the past. All he resorted to was merely attacking an old man and sometimes a straw man. Every single one of Dave's objections against the free thinking argument have been refuted. Thus, although David Pallmann might not use the free thinking argument as part of his case for theism, he has provided absolutely zero reason for you not to use it. In fact, J.P. Moreland and I have explained exactly why you should use the free thinking argument when discussing ultimate reality. So make sure to read our essay entitled An Explanation and Defense of the Free Thinking Argument. Find the link in the description below. And one more thing. Pallmann also rejects the moral argument for God's existence. See my article on the FreeThinking Ministries website entitled Objective Morality versus David Pallmann to see why you should also use the moral argument when discussing ultimate reality. So bottom line, David Pallmann's YouTube channel has recently been devoted to attacking arguments for the existence of God. He named his channel Faith Because of Reason. This name is basically stolen from William Lane Craig. It's just another way of saying reasonable faith. Be that as it may, one must ask Pallmann what he means by because of reason. Does David Pallmann have faith because he was determined to have it, based upon how untrustworthy antecedent conditions determined him to think and process this information? Or did David Pallmann actively use his powers of reason to carefully infer that Christianity is probably true? If it's the former, he has horrible reason to have faith. If it's the latter, then David Pallmann is a free thinker in the libertarian sense. I'm thankful that Dave made my point for me. Dave, to address you directly, again, I want to congratulate you on your recent accomplishment, graduating from Trinity College of the Bible with a bachelor's degree. In my humble opinion, Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary is one of the best, and that's why I'm honored to teach there as a professor of theology. I encourage you to continue your education. Indeed, I'd love to take you under my wing and disciple you at Trinity's graduate level. If we could share that time together, I'm confident that you will eventually see that both the moral argument and the free thinking argument stand strong and provide powerful evidence for the biblical worldview. With all that said, as the Bible encourages us to do in Isaiah 1:18, well, stay reasonable. Josh, do you have anything else you'd like to add as we close this video?
I don't think so. I think you anything I would say seems rather superfluous. There is about 2 minutes left in the video that we didn't watch. We don't necessarily have to watch it. It's kind of just summarizing what his statements are. Did you want to finish off that video as
No,
we?
I would just encourage our viewers to, if they think we're missing something vital in his summary, go watch his video.
Yeah. One thing I want to clarify, and you've said it multiple times, but I feel like it does need to be stated, is neither of us are saying, and again, I don't know you, Dave, that he is a determinist or believes determinism is true. Just that it seems to me that the video takes, first of all, like you said, an old argument, and second of all, either misunderstands some of the arguments or deliberately misrepresents. So yeah, so I guess that's what I have to say. And to say, stay tuned to Free Thinking Ministries YouTube channel for all sorts of things. We got things coming up. FT Monthly's coming up. We've got, you also have an awesome opportunity this Friday, tomorrow. We're recording this on a Thursday, right? Do we want to talk about that, or should we just leave people on pins and needles?
Yeah, I've got a big debate coming up tomorrow on the Unbelievable show. So by the time this video is released, that debate will have already happened. So we'll be discussing that, I'm sure.
Yes. Awesome. Yeah, we'll love to get through that as well. Well, we made it in about an hour and a half, so about 4.5 hours on this 48-minute video, but it was necessary. I think it was good, and glad to do it with you, Tim.
Yeah, well, I want to be thorough, and you know, when something like this comes out, if a scholar, and David Pallmann is not there yet, he's got a long way to go before being considered an official scholar who contributes to the field and on these things, or contributes to the literature. If somebody who is a PhD philosopher or theologian comes after my published work, then I feel an obligation to respond to them. Sometimes I will make an exception when the objector has a decent sized following. And with Dave, as a former student at Trinity, as a professor in the graduate level, you know, he graduated with a BA, so with the undergrad. I also felt it was good to address his concerns, since we have this tie, these ties to Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. So I hope these two videos responding to David Pallmann are enlightening to those who are watching. And if further questions are raised, please send them in to our website, and Josh will make sure that I get them.
Yeah.
He's doing a good job making sure I don't miss those things. So
we'll make sure we get to those. And one last thing before we head out, I just want to say, a lot of stuff was said. We're going to go through it. We're not going to edit it very much. But if things come across as personal attacks from here, that was not the intention. We're engaging with somebody who has chosen to engage with Tim's work in this manner, and so some of it had to come across with how it was approached from their side. So it wasn't, in my opinion, an attempt to attack anyone's character, but bring to questions, why would you approach it in this manner? At least that's the way I see it.
Yeah. That's well said.
All right. Well, we will see you much more on FreeThinking Ministries YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe, hit the notification bell, share the video if you feel so inclined. And as always, like we like to say on the FreeThinking Ministries YouTube channel, stay reasonable.
Stay reasonable.